Hi, I'm Eric Lenask. We're here at Editor's Day, Santa Clara. And talking with me now is Ray Potter from SafeLogic. Ray, great to see you again.
Thanks for having me.
So, security, breaches, hacks, you can't turn on the news or open a web browser these days without seeing some, the latest hack that's taken place or the latest breach. Mm-hmm. Is it really all that new, or is it just that they're becoming more highly publicized?
I think there's two things going on. They're becoming more highly publicized. They're happening more frequently because there's more holes. But I think as kind of consumers and industry, we're getting a little immune to it at this point, right? Especially from a consumer side. You hear about another breach at another department store. It makes the headlines one day, and then it's gone the next. You might get a new credit card in the mail, but that's about the end of it, right? So it starts to get a little bit more serious when we look at breaches with healthcare, breaches with the OPM and federal government, for example, because it's much more sensitive data. So it really depends on the data that's being compromised at the end of the day. If it's just a bunch of credit card numbers, that's a rectifiable situation. If it's something like the OPM breach, well, we've got fingerprint data, we've got living records for 10 years, we've got a whole lot of very sensitive data that ends up in the wrong hands. It could be a really, really bad deal. So it really just depends on the breach.
So basically, on the consumer side, we've become a little bit desensitized to it. How would you characterize that in terms of the folks that are responsible for the data? So the IT managers at businesses, and also on the government side, are they more aware, more conscious of what they have to do?
I think, by and large, yes. And where you see that, if you're a publicly traded company and your stock price drops and the CEO is fired, we see that happening. But I think I'm more concerned about some of the small, medium-sized business where they may not have, for one thing, accountability, but they may not have the resources to do full-blown, risk management policies and procedures, and have a CISO, have someone that's responsible for security. So there is that sense of immunity and sense of non-accountability that we need to work on. But the problem is, where does the buck stop, right?
And how do you approach that?
Ideally, the way to approach that is to look at data within your organization and run kind of a risk management framework against it, right? Figure out what data, what the data is, where it is, how sensitive it is, what systems, what daemons, what processes have access to that data, and then how do you protect it, right? And how do you protect it in a way that also balances usability, because that's one of the challenges we have in security is managing security versus usability, right? So the data has to be usable and accessible, but protected. And there's a variety of ways to do that. It's the traditional people process technology, right? So having risk management plans, having technology in place to encrypt data strongly, having technology to provide sufficient access control to the data. All these things kind of piece together to form kind of a layered security posture.
You kind of touched on or mentioned the government a moment ago. We haven't really talked about it. That said, there have been some fairly high-profile government breaches as well.
Sure.
How does what governments do and how vendors that work with the government space, how do they have to take a different, or do they have to take a more careful approach to security?
They do. They have to take, I'd say, a much more formal approach. So, for example, let's take the concept of someone wanting to sell to federal government, right? So it's a little different than, signing up a reseller to put you on the shelf at a department store or something like that, right? If you've got a security product that employs strong encryption, it has to go through a formal third-party validation process called FIPS 140-2. So, this is traditionally a pretty long and intensive process where a product will go through and be documented against this particular standard, tested by a third-party lab, and eventually blessed by the government. So there's a whole lot of different rules and policies and procedures. That's actually kind of why SafeLogic exists, is to provide encryption modules that are built for these regulated environments that help companies get to market quicker, because it is a little bit more challenging getting into federal, and that's our job, is to make it easier for our customers.
So making it easy for your customers, where do you fall into sort of the risk model, the responsibility level, if something does happen? Is there a place where you
no, there
carry
is
risk?
There's always a risk, right? So we've got all sorts of terms specified in our license agreements and whatnot. But I think the biggest risk is reputation and things like that. Fortunately, the way that we build our products and what we do from an internal perspective, the certifications that we receive on them, I mean, it goes through sufficient scrutiny that it minimizes that risk. And frankly, with what we do, an attacker isn't really going to try to brute force the encryption module, right? They're not going to try to brute force the key. That's computationally intensive, and there's easier ways into a system. However, any system still has to have strong encryption for both data in transit and data at rest. But like I said, with the breaches, it's a little bit easier to target different attack points.
What? Excuse me. So one of the things that you always hear is, the hackers, the cyber criminals, always half a step ahead of any security companies out there. If that's the case, what are companies like SafeLogic doing to try to at least maintain pace and protect your customers?
Sure.
Because that, at the end of the day, as you said, is what your role is.
Absolutely. No, and you're right. They are seemingly always step ahead, and security does tend to be a little bit more reactionary sometimes. I mean, there are some very cool technologies out there that take a more proactive approach in terms of threat detection and things like that. But it's still very challenging, and it's a tough business sometimes. So what we do from our side is making sure that our encryption modules are always up to date, right? So when Apple releases a new iOS, that we've got our encryption modules ready for iOS 9, ready for the build chain, ready for all that stuff, so that when if they're deploying across the enterprise or deploying the solution, it's ready. They don't have to wait. And that's usually the challenge, right? Is folks are out there, whether it's the Android or Linux or Windows, people are fixing holes. They're patching their operating systems, and our customers' applications need to run on those operating systems, and the encryption needs to function properly, right? So we've got to make sure that we've got that end game in mind, so that when our customers are updating, that's just one less thing they have to worry about.
What's next? Anything new and exciting?
Yeah, we got a lot of tricks up our sleeve, right? So you're going to see a lot more of us in the IoT and embedded space. We've got some products being released there. We've got a few tricks up our sleeve. So just kind of trying to stay a step ahead and making sure that we've got strong encryption available to folks who need it on a multitude of different platforms.
Well, I think the IoT space certainly is a logical place. And especially as that industry continues to scale, and you're just going to see more and more connected things out there. Is theoretically an easy entry point,
right,
for anyone looking to get in.
It's easy and it's not, because everyone's talking about IoT. Everyone kind of accepts it as the next wave, but it's very challenging from a security perspective because it's different, right? Every vertical is different. Every installation is different. So, mobility, it's certainly challenging from a security sense, but it's much more siloed, right? We have Android, iOS, and Windows. We had BlackBerry. They're still
for a little while,
doing all right. They're actually doing better, but anyway.
But I think they're running on Android now.
They are. That's right. It's going to be interesting to see how that develops. But it's a much more limited ecosystem, right? So when we get to IoT, it's practically limitless, right? It's critical infrastructure, it's SCADA systems, it's enterprise, it's consumer, it's automotive, and everything with different systems, different sensors, different technologies, different protocols. There's not going to be a one-size-fits-all with IoT, right? So we see quite a number of companies standing up and saying, "Oh, we're the leader in IoT security." It's like, okay, for what? How? What are you actually doing, right? So we've got our own answer to that, but it is certainly challenging. But it's a little glamorous, and that's where everyone tends to want to be. But you'll see us around.
It's a hot buzzword, so that's where you got to be.
Exactly.
Ray, as always, great chatting with you. Thank you for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much. Appreciate it.